Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ninth week in our course on drugs and behavior. So for the next few weeks, we'll be talking about some naturally occurring substances. And because they're naturally occurring, they have a long history as compared to some of the recently developed psychotherapeutic medication or some of the synthetic stimulants. So this week we'll talk about alcohol, and then we'll talk about tobacco, marijuana, hallucinogens, some of which are naturally occurring and some are synthetic, um, over the next few weeks. So this is sort of a different section to our course. Also, as I mentioned in an announcement, the midterm grades are posted. If you would like to see your individual performance in terms of what you got right and wrong, just right click on your exam grade in the Grade Center, and you should be able to navigate to an option called View Attempt, and then you can see which questions you got right and which ones you got wrong. Um, Also, I have posted the next assignment, which is the second paper. So that will be due on November 13th. It's very similar to the first assignment in terms of my expectations. The subject matter is a little different. This time you will pick a controversial issue when it comes to drug use, and I've listed some available topics. Uh, as before, you can email me if you have an alternative one, and I can approve that for you. But be sure to let me know. Not all topics are okay. Anything we've discussed extensively already um, probably won't be approved. But there are some topics that we've touched on in discussion, for example, that are on the list. And so if you'd like to delve into that a little bit deeper, do some more research on it, then you can pick that topic. It is a research paper, and the research requirements are listed in the document, so please read over those as well. Okay, so this week we'll be talking about alcohol. So we'll start by looking at the history of alcohol, and of course, because it is a natural product, it has a fairly long history. We'll talk about the effects of alcohol, mainly next time in terms of the effects on the individual. This time we'll talk about the interaction between society and alcohol. And then later on we'll talk about trends in usage. So who drinks alcohol, to what extent, why. In this session in particular, we're going to be focusing on the historical aspects. So we'll learn about the early history of alcohol. And we've already talked about some of this in our lectures on the history of drugs and the history of drug regulation. So this will be some new content. So I'll gloss over some of the things we've already covered. One of the things we'll learn is learn the differences between different types of alcoholic beverages. And this is important because different beverages have different alcohol content. So that's the most important aspect for us. But also our society has different attitudes toward different kinds of alcoholic beverages. Some are more popular, some are viewed as more harmful. But in the end, they all contain alcohol. So we'll see how society has responded to alcohol and alcoholic beverages. But first, last week's discussion questions. So there was a question about caffeine and whether there should be additional regulations for caffeine. So it's a psychoactive substance. Many psychoactive substances are subject to regulation, but caffeine isn't one of them. One of the points that was made in the discussion forum was that perhaps there should be age regulations. Right now, a child can go in and buy a caffeinated beverage without any oversight. And this, of course, isn't true for drugs like alcohol and drugs like tobacco, nicotine. So should there be regulations that monitor whether someone of a certain age is trying to obtain caffeine and keep them from doing so if they're too young? But the other issue is the influence of parents, and a lot of people came down on the side of not producing new legal regulations, but letting parents regulate their children's behavior and regulate their caffeine consumption. And this is a good point. So obviously, our parental groups, our peer groups have a high degree of influence on drug use behavior. Um, and of course, it's always great if parents can express to their children what the pros and cons of drugs are and when it's appropriate to use them and when it's not. Um, and so one of the issues with that, of course, is that not every parent is as involved in the behavior of their children for a variety of reasons, and not every individual is as educated on the effects of caffeine. Now, caffeine, it turns out, is a fairly harmless substance relative to some of the other drugs we've talked about. Um, Nevertheless, there are behavioral effects. Um, Most people came down on the side of letting parents deal with it, but there were also some good points about uh, possible regulations for children of a certain age not being allowed access to caffeine. The other topic was in regard to mental illness. So last week we talked about psychotherapeutic drugs, and of course, hand in hand with that is the issue of mental health and mental illness in our society. Especially when it comes to disorders like schizophrenia, which are both common and highly disruptive to the lives of the sufferer and individuals around him or her, um, the the institutionalization of individuals with schizophrenia has gone down over the last few decades, um, mainly because the institutions at the time had poor conditions and there weren't that many treatment options. So people were just sort of imprisoned more or less indefinitely. So one issue that was brought up was perhaps mental institutions could help because the issue is that a lot of individuals with schizophrenia end up in some stage of the correctional system or end up on the street. They end up homeless. But how we can't ethically force people to take medication. So how do we deal with this? Because patients will often stop taking their medication either because of the side effects or because um, they think they're cured. So is it possible to bring mental institutions back in some way? Now, it was ruled illegal to indefinitely institutionalize someone, so that's not really on the table anymore. But is it possible to have mental institutions that have um, better treatment options that are more sanitary in terms of their conditions? Um, it's possible. A lot of the role that used to be taken up by mental institutions is, of course, now handled by the prison system. So the prison system has available psychiatric interventions. Whether those two should be the same entity or not, whether we should have people with severe mental disorders in the prison system or whether they should be handled separately is a big issue still. And of course, one important sort of arrow in our quiver for dealing with this problem is education. So how do we tell just the average person? How does the average person know what resources are available if they or someone they know needs mental health services? Also, how do we recognize mental health issues? So this is an issue of education and outreach, making sure everyone is aware of the services that are available, and making sure everyone is aware what mental illness is, what the symptoms are, when someone might need help. And then finally, an important issue is to avoid stigmatization. And of course, that is the perception that individuals with mental illness are weak-willed or are immoral, are somehow inherently inferior. And so that inclination has been around for obviously a very long time. But it's detrimental to the person's mental health because the person often will avoid treatment because of the stigma associated with mental health services. And this still goes on today. This is not a problem that's gone away. Many people are reluctant to seek mental health services for severe problems, but also for things that are fairly common, like depression, that are very treatable, because they're afraid of the associations they'll now carry if they seek out mental health services. So we want to avoid the stigmatization so that people seek help. We also want to make sure that they're aware of the help they can avail themselves of. So good discussion. As a side note, now that we're in discussion groups, it's important to remember that the idea is for everyone to work together and create a comprehensive response, um, which says something about the length, but also sort of the tone and the structure of the post. So it is not the intention of the group discussion project to just copy and paste 4 individual paragraphs from the 4 members of the group. The idea is to discuss it and come up with a comprehensive response that represents everyone, but isn't just 4 separate people's opinions. So keep that in mind, and moving forward, we will stick with the the current discussion groups, and then I will shuffle them again in a couple weeks. Okay, so moving on to the topic for today, alcohol. So alcohol is just a chemical, a fairly simple one. It's ethanol. Alcohol technically is a group of chemicals. As I mentioned in the first lecture of the course, ethanol is what we usually mean when we refer to alcohol, just sort of socially. Alcohol, in terms of in drinking alcohol, is ethanol. Other kinds of alcohol will have similar effects, but there are also some really bad consequences. For example, wood alcohol or methanol is very dangerous, even though it is also intoxicating. But anyway, alcohol is produced by the process of fermentation, which is the conversion of sugar into ethanol. And the way that happens is usually through yeast. So yeast are a type of fungus, so they're a microorganism, and yeast will consume sugar and excrete ethanol as a waste product. This process also involves the release of carbon dioxide, which is why certain alcoholic beverages have carbon dioxide. They're carbonated because the carbon dioxide the yeast produced was kept in the beverage. But ethanol is a smaller molecule than sugar, and so sugar turns into ethanol, a small molecule, and carbon dioxide, another small one. So anyway, so yeast is responsible for turning that sugar into ethanol, and there are various kinds of fermented beverages. They all depend on yeast. They all depend on the conversion of sugar into ethanol. But for example, there's beer, which we've all heard of. We'll be talking more about that in a couple slides. There's also wine, which we've all heard of. We'll be talking less about some of the other kinds, like cider, which is made from fruit. Beer, obviously, is made from grain, so usually barley. Wine is made from typically grapes. You also have things like rice wine, like sake, but those are technically more like beer than traditional wine. They're just called rice wine. Anyway, we have cider, which is made from fruit. We also have mead, which is one of the oldest alcoholic beverages, and it's made from honey. Honey, of course, is already very sweet, has a high sugar content, and so it's easy to turn the sugar and honey into alcohol. But that's really all we'll say about cider and mead today. But as you can see, most of the time, these beverages are classified by their ingredients. Again, they all contain alcohol. It's the same molecule, so it's going to have the same mechanism of action, the same effects, and how they differ is their alcohol content, but the way we typically classify them is what's in them. There are also distilled beverages, and we'll see this is an important category. So it turns out that yeast that turn sugar into ethanol eventually are poisoned by that ethanol. So if you put yeast and sugar together in water, they'll turn that sugar into ethanol, but once it gets to about 15% ethanol, the solution, that will eventually kill the yeast. So yeast can't survive basically swimming around in their own waste products for too long because that builds up too much. So in order to get an alcohol content higher than around 15%, you have to go through a process called distillation. And the way this works is you have some alcohol solution, so the yeast have already produced an alcoholic beverage like wine, for example, and then you heat the liquid. And what this does is this vaporizes the alcohol. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than water and some other liquids. And so the alcohol, when you heat it up, the solution, the alcohol will come out first. So then what you do with that vapor is you cool it down. And of course, if you remember from high school chemistry, warm air can hold more vapor than cold air can. That's why, for example, water condenses on mirrors if someone's taking a hot shower. Because the mirror is cold, the air is warm, And so the air that's right next to the mirror can't hold as much of the water. So the water condenses out. You see that liquid coming out of the vapor, coming out of the air. And so this is the same process. The vapor is in the air, and it's going from a warm environment to a cool one. And when you cool that air down, it can't hold all that liquid anymore. And so you condense that liquid out of the vapor, and you collect what's called the condensate. So this is how you get a higher concentration of ethanol. You take that mixture of air and ethanol vapor, cool it down, and then you get a higher concentration of ethanol. So that's how you get above that 15% barrier with yeast. So still beverages have been around for a while, not as long as wine or beer or mead. Um, in the ancient world, or in the Mediterranean, it's thought that distillation was developed around the 1st century AD, but it wasn't applied to alcoholic beverages until around the 13th century. So some of the first distilled beverages were brandy, which is made from wine, and whiskey, which is made from grains. Whiskey is also sometimes spelled without the E. There's a whole debate about whether it should have the E in there or not. We're not going to go into that. But whiskey is often made from corn or wheat or barley. So whiskey isn't quite as stringently defined as brandy is. So those are some of the first distilled alcoholic beverages. And beverages, all beverages, but it's the most commonly noted for distilled beverages. The alcohol content is measured in terms of proof. And all proof is it's a number, and it's double the percentage of ethanol. So pure ethanol is 200 proof, because it's 100% ethanol. Whereas if it's 100 proof, that means it's 50% ethanol. And you see this on distilled beverages like whiskey and gin and vodka. But of course, wine and beer also have alcohol content, so they can also be measured in proof. So beer is, of course, a very common alcoholic beverage. It's made from water, barley, and hops. Those are the required ingredients. There are two categories of beer. There are lagers and there are ales. They're just slightly different fermentation processes. The temperature differs in terms of what temperature they're fermented at. Also, where the yeast are in the container that's producing the beer. Again, this is a detail we're not going to go into heavily, but if you've heard that term, lager or ale, and of course there are subtypes, that describes the fermentation process. And beer is generally 4 to 6% alcohol. But of course, beer is generally consumed in a larger quantity than, for example, whiskey is, or even wine is. So as we'll see, the amount of alcohol in the beverage, the less the alcohol, the larger the size the beverage usually is. And that will factor in when we talk about how people consume alcohol and blood alcohol level. So some recent trends, of course, we'll get into prohibition here in a minute, but there were relatively few breweries right after prohibition, not surprisingly. But as they became more and more common, they started to merge. And so there are just a handful of really large brewing companies, things like Anheuser-Busch, Miller, Coors. These are all companies we've heard of, we've seen on TV. And so here is a table from your book that describes basically how much of the market each of these companies has. So the vast majority of beer is produced and distributed by these large companies. But recently, and particularly in Colorado, where we are, you see the rise of craft breweries. And so these are smaller scale operations, and there are actually laws about what determines whether something is a craft brewery or not. Sam Adams is actually the biggest craft brewery in the U.S., and it has had to lobby to change laws because it's become so popular that it produces so much beer that under the old law, it wouldn't qualify as a craft brewery anymore. So that the amount a craft brewery can produce and still be considered a craft brewery has changed over time. There were also microbreweries, which are sometimes synonymous with craft breweries. Sometimes they're more like brew pubs. But the idea here is that this is an entity that just produces beer for consumption on the premises. This is an even smaller scale operation. And of course, some people brew their own beer as well. So we see a number of levels in terms of production capacity for beer. And recently, this isn't in your book because this just happened. SAB Miller, which is a multinational corporation, and Anheuser-Busch InBev, which is another multinational corporation, have just merged in the last couple weeks. So the company that makes Miller, that makes Molson, that makes Bud and Bud Light, these are all now going to be one giant company. So that's a little recent news in the brewing world. Okay, there's also wine, which again we've all heard of. And of course, wine is made from grapes. As I mentioned, things like rice wine are more like beer in terms of the process that produces them, even though we refer to them as wine. And wine is typically around 12% alcohol. As with beer, there's some variance. It can be up to 15%, but 12% is about the average. And there are a variety of types of wine. Your book makes the distinction between generics and varietals. So generics are usually labeled referring to a region, so they're supposed to imitate that region in terms of the wine it produces. And others are varietals, so it'll refer to the type of grape, like Sauvignon Blanc or Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot. But broadly, wine comes in red and white, and this is just a question of whether the skin is still left on the grape when the beverage is made. There's also sparkling wine, which is often referred to as champagne. Champagne is technically the region in France, so wines that are carbonated that aren't from that region technically are just sparkling wines. You also have fortified wines, and these are things like Madeira and port and sherry. So these are wines that are then fortified with some kind of distilled alcoholic beverage, usually brandy. So this is a way of getting the alcohol content a little bit higher, also introducing different flavors. So they're called fortified because of that extra alcohol content. So for distilled beverages, there's a huge variety in what goes into distilled beverages. Really, alcohol is the only ingredient that has to be in there. So these beverages often contain congeners, which is just a way of saying other molecules, oils, and other types of alcohol that are present in the beverage that are not ethanol. And this is often what gives different distilled beverages their distinct flavor and their distinct odor. So there are a bunch of these. The notable ones are whiskey, as I mentioned. Whiskey has a variety of forms. There is Scotch whiskey, which is often just called Scotch. There is bourbon whiskey, which is made here in the U.S. And there are blended whiskeys, there are Canadian whiskey, Irish whiskey. So many regions have their own form of whiskey. But the ingredient there is just some form of grain. So it could be wheat, it could be corn, it could be barley, it could be rye. So all of these things make for different regional versions of whiskey. There's gin, which is a little more floral, and it involves the juniper bush. So there's extract from the juniper bush that gives gin its distinctive aroma. Vodka is sort of a catch-all. It's kind of a definition by exclusion. It can be made from potatoes. It's perhaps most commonly made from wheat, but it tends to be flavorless or close to it. And that's really what makes vodka. It tends to be flavorless and colorless. And there are also liqueurs, which are distilled, but tend to have a lower alcohol content. So the previously mentioned distilled beverages usually are in the range of 80 to 100 proof, so 40 to 50% ethanol. liqueurs tend to be more like 40 proof, so higher alcohol content than wine, but not as much as whiskey. And these liqueurs are often things like cordials and aperitifs, um, so they tend to be more flavored. Um, they can be floral, they can be fruit flavored, and they're often involved in cocktails. And distilled beverages are important for our purposes because they're historically the target of what are called temperance movements. And so that brings us into the history of alcohol consumptions, particularly in the US. So for a long time, alcohol was consumed very regularly. It wasn't just a social beverage in the evening. It was consumed in the morning. It was consumed with every meal. Um, and alcohol beverages were often preferred and more popular than water. And the reason is that uh, alcoholic beverages were far less likely to be contaminated by bacteria and other harmful microorganisms. So water can go stagnant. It can develop microorganisms that can make you sick. And so alcoholic beverages didn't really have that problem, partially because alcohol is a disinfectant. Certainly, at high enough concentration, it'll kill bacteria. Um, but also because there's often a heating process in the making of the alcoholic beverage, and so it kills all the bacteria when it gets heated up, and then the alcohol keeps new bacteria from coming in. But basically, alcohol was safer. But it was often consumed in the form of beer or wine, and even back then, the alcohol content was lower, especially for beer. And eventually, you have the appearance of what's called the temperance movement. And you saw the beginning of this movement, this movement to reduce the consumption of alcohol around the late 1700s. People started writing pamphlets and advocating against the drinking of alcohol. And this really coincides with the development of modern distillation techniques. So as I mentioned, around the 13th century, individuals started distilling alcoholic beverages. Um, but even then, they weren't very high content in terms of alcohol. It wasn't until the late 1700s that you had more modern distillation techniques where you could get beverages that were 80 proof or 100 proof. And so we see this coincidence of of society trying to decrease the popularity of a drug once the technology becomes available to really purify that drug. And this is something we saw in our section on the regulation of drugs with opium. So once we had the ability to purify opium and to purify morphine and to synthesize these things, that's when you started seeing a lot more negative consequences because the drugs were more powerful. So you started seeing society respond to the potency of that drug. And alcohol is similar. As soon as you get those really potent alcoholic beverages, you start seeing the rise in alcohol dependence. The symptoms become more noticeable, and so society responded to that. So they started recognizing the symptoms of dependence. And particularly the symptoms of withdrawal. So what happens when a heavy drinker, everyone knew what alcohol did if you consumed it in large quantities, but it started to become more obvious what the chronic effects were. And originally, these temperance movements were aimed at distilled beverages, not really wine or beer, because distilled beverages are stronger. They produce more acute effects. They have more alcohol than wine or beer does, so not surprisingly, they might more commonly, more easily create dependence. And so this went on for over 100 years. This led to what we call in the U.S. prohibition. Prohibition itself is just a word that means the banning of something or the forbidding of it. But in the U.S., it means a particular period in our history where the sale and production of alcoholic beverages was banned for the most part. There were some exceptions. You could have you could make your own alcoholic beverages as an individual, but companies weren't allowed to manufacture or sell them. And there have been state by state prohibition even as early as the mid 1800s. So this wasn't without precedent, but it became a federal law in the early 1900s. And partially, this is really a response to demographic changes, which again is something we saw with the crackdown on cocaine and opium, is that we had different immigrant populations coming in that was perceived as threatening, and they also had different drinking cultures. Um, so we see demographic changes. We see more individuals from Ireland, from the Mediterranean, come into the U.S. And of course, they brought with them their own customs when it came to alcohol. There was also a rise in religious revivalisms. This was an increase in the amount of evangelical Protestantism. And so one of the offshoots of this was this temperance movement. This idea that alcohol was a moral issue, and that it was sinful to drink in excess. Drinking in excess had always been sort of frowned upon, but now that this attitude had become more extreme. The idea that any alcohol, at least in terms of distilled beverages, was unacceptable. This was a new phenomenon. So you have the 18th Amendment to the Constitution that's ratified in 1919. It comes into effect a year later in 1920, and from that point on, the sale and production of alcohol is outlawed. So what did this do? So of course we saw a rise in patent medicines, which we talked about a couple of units ago, and also speakeasies, which were illegal bars. So people still wanted to consume alcoholic beverages, and they had to find an alternative means to get them. So they could either drink alcoholic beverages illegally, or they could obtain alcohol legally through things like patent medicines, which still had alcohol in them, but they weren't marketed as alcoholic beverages. And so these laws were enforced by the Coast Guard in terms of cracking down on bootleggers trying to smuggle alcohol into the country, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of Justice. So I'm going to not spend too much time here because we've already talked about this in our section on the regulation of drugs. But we have these different agencies. Remember, it wasn't until decades later that we have the appearance of the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. And so we have these different agencies responsible for different aspects of the use of alcohol. So the Department of Treasury, of course, was very concerned with taxation. Coast Guard was concerned with smuggling. The Department of Justice was concerned with the domestic production of alcohol and adherence to alcohol laws. And as your book points out, prohibition did actually work to some degree. There was a decrease in the consumption of alcoholic beverages. The evidence suggests that it was usually infrequent or moderate drinkers that stopped drinking. Those that were already heavy drinkers, that were already dependent, of course, this didn't really do much to stem their alcohol habit. But it did decrease the amount of alcohol consumed in the U.S. But it was accompanied by an increase in certain forms of crime. Now, certainly when drinking alcohol becomes illegal, you're going to see an increase in crime just because people now drinking alcohol are technically committing a crime. But of course, alcohol was now a big underground industry. And so there was crime associated with the black market, different groups competing to produce alcohol and sell it at a large profit. And so you had organized crime around the production and distribution of alcohol. And for a variety of reasons, this was repealed 13 years later by the 21st Amendment. So prohibition only lasted for 13 years. But it did have these effects, and it also set the stage for later regulation, as we've already talked about. So afterwards, we had a return to regulation by individual states. And many states were alcohol-free, so-called dry states, for a long time. There's a lot of variety in state laws, and we still see that today in terms of how alcohol can be sold, who can sell it, what days it can be sold on, what kind of alcoholic beverages and how strong those beverages can be. There's huge variety from state to state. You also used to see some variety in drinking ages. So in some places it was 18, in some places it was 21. Now that's uniform. 21 is the drinking age, of course. And of course, the taxation of alcohol is an interesting issue. And this is actually related to one of the possible paper topics coming up for your second paper. So this is thought to be one of the issues that led to the repeal of prohibition. Was suddenly the government was missing out on this big revenue source. If all the alcohol was being produced and consumed in an underground fashion, they couldn't tax the sale of alcohol anymore. So you had groups that were advocating the repeal of prohibition in order to increase tax revenue. We saw another tax increase in the early 90s, but it turns out that only led to a small decrease in consumption. It's thought that it would really take a very large price hike to make any sort of dent in the degree of alcohol consumption in the U.S. society. Okay, so that is it for the history of alcoholic beverages. Next time, we'll still be looking at alcohol, but we'll be looking at how alcohol works, its mechanism of action, as well as what effects alcohol has, both in terms of acute use, so what happens immediately, and chronic use, as well as the behavioral and physiological effects. We'll also look at demographic trends, so who drinks alcohol, how's alcohol consumption changed over time, and so we'll get into that next time as well. And I will see you then.